So let us make a start, and if people will join us, that's perfectly fine. Welcome to this Positively Rural event. It's really good to see familiar faces gathered here this evening, and it's really lovely to see some new faces as well. So I want to welcome one and all. For those who don't know me, I'm Carla Quinette, part of the Learning Network in the Yorkshire Plus region. So I think it's a really pretty place to live. We cover most of Yorkshire with a little of North East Derbyshire in as well, if you just want to kind of locate us geographically. It's of course really good to welcome our speakers this evening. Welcome to Elizabeth and Caroline. I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a moment. But first and foremost, it'd be a hopeless webinar without participants. So we want to make sure that you feel really welcome this evening. For those who've not met Caroline before, Caroline's been involved in one form of ministry or another over the last 35 years. She began kind of life in rural ministry in Lincolnshire and has experienced a variety as she's moved around the country, from Somerset to Cambridgeshire, Cornwall, Kent, and now in Yorkshire. Looking at how we share ministry ecumenically is a real priority for Caroline. Elizabeth, it's good to welcome you too. Elizabeth is a Methodist minister. She spent 15 years initially in North Yorkshire before serving for the past 7 years as a national rural officer. She can't wait to move back to Yorkshire when she sits down this summer. That's a Methodist peculiar term for when you retire. But we really are looking forward to welcome you as you sit down in Yorkshire, Elizabeth. Before I begin, can I offer just one or two housekeeping to help us get through this evening with success? We're obviously not hoping or anticipating any technical difficulties, but if we do experience any, please be kind to us and we'll rectify them as quickly as we can. If it's your Wi-Fi that goes down, don't panic, just use the link that you used to get here initially and we'll let you back into the room. During the plenary sessions, we'd be most grateful if you would keep yourselves on mute, your sound muted. That helps people to hear the best. The sessions will be recorded, so if you want to ensure that your face does not appear on the recording for whatever reason, please will you stop your video to use that function. It's on the left on most screens. You need to speak to either the host or the whole webinar. If possible, would you use the chat function? And if not, you can raise your hand using the reactions button. If you can't do either of those, then do just take yourself off mute. You'll be invited to do that by the host, and we can allow you to speak that way. During the breakout rooms, we really encourage you to take yourselves off mute, because otherwise it's going to be a pointless exercise. It'd be good to share stories and conversations together. Feel free to put on your cameras there. Those won't be recorded. The breakout rooms are not recorded. So if that gives you some reassurance, that's for you to know. Obviously, we really actively encourage you to share learning from this webinar, but we really request that you don't share other people's stories. That's their story and for them to share. So share the learning, but not people's stories. That would be great. And when we do move into breakout rooms, there will be a facilitator in each of those rooms to help you through that part of the evening. So with no further ado, I hope I've covered everything. If not, somebody will correct me. It's a real pleasure to hand over to Caroline and to Elizabeth, who are going to guide us through this evening. So welcome again, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say and share.
Thank you for that welcome. Did you want to say anything, Caroline?
Just to say it's really good to see everybody, and looking forward to this evening and learning myself, I'm sure. So it's good.
Excellent. Now we'll start with some prayers. Most of you will know that the Sunday just past has been Rogation. So I wanted to spend some time using a couple of those prayers and thinking about how we bless our communities. As you know, Rogation comes from the Latin word to ask, and it was originally about asking God's blessing on the emerging crops. Farming year is different now, and the crops are well on their way very often at the time that Rogation comes around. But they still need a blessing, as do those that nurture the crops, the farming community. And this year, more than ever, our communities need to feel God's blessing. So let's pray. We come before you, our God and sustainer, remembering that you are our creator and the source of all being. Out of your love, the universe was born. From primordial darkness, you put in place all that is needed for growth and saw that it was good. You have put the world into our hands. May we recognize your spirit within it, disturbing and challenging us to care for creation, for the weak and the deprived. Lord, we remember that we are called by you to nourish the earth and its diversity of life, to share the gifts you have given with one another and with the poor of the world. Amen. In a moment of quietness, think about the communities of which we are part and ask for God's blessing on those communities. And a prayer of blessing for all of us. May the Creator God continually inspire us with the wonders of creation. May Jesus the Son walk with us, especially through the dark times. May the life-giving Spirit bring us glimpses of the kingdom. May the God, the three in one, bless us now and always. Amen. So we come to the beginning of this webinar, thinking about festivals. We're not thinking about festival churches as such. We're thinking about how we can celebrate festivals in ways that reach out to our communities, why they might be important. After all, we all like to celebrate, don't we? We celebrate birthdays, anniversaries of all kinds, and the church is no different. We know that festivals are integral to our faith. In the Old Testament, festivals were important in bringing the whole community of God together. The festival of unleavened bread and Passover provided the opportunity to retell the story of that first Passover and the escape from Egypt. The festivals of weeks and of booths originally marked the end of the grain harvest and the end of the farming year. However, they soon became linked with God's saving acts and a reminder of God the Creator. Even later, they became pilgrim festivals, where people travelled back to the temple in Jerusalem, back to their roots, to really celebrate God in those ways. But in the Christian calendar, we have all kinds of festivals. There's Christmas, Easter and Pentecost, the festivals that are structured around the life of Jesus. These events are very visual. I think sometimes we forget that, just how much they can be used to tell the story. After all, the medieval church used to take its miracle plays out on the street to remind people through that sort of festival just who Jesus was. And we can use those as very creative ways of communicating the story of Jesus to others. We know too that there is a rhythm to the church year. For Methodists, September, everything begins again, doesn't it? And we want to hide, perhaps. I'm going to have a holiday this September, just because I can. And then we go through, November is then we have harvest, we go through at the time of remembrance in November, Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost. It wasn't until I moved to a rural community, though, that I began to appreciate the other rhythms of life that occur in communities. The seasons are experienced much more in the countryside than they ever were in the city. I recall as a child not knowing what proper darkness was until I went camping with the guides, because in London it just didn't get dark. So suddenly there was a new way of seeing. And there's also the rhythm of the farming year. And behind that, a whole set of medieval agricultural festivals. But why is any of this important for the church today? Festivals provide a good opportunity for the church to connect with a wider community. And we all know that in rural areas, the boundaries between church and community can be quite flexible and fluid. And people can feel that they are part of the church in many different ways. Research conducted by Bishop David Walker came up with four particular ways that rural people have of belonging to church. They belong through place, relationships, activities, and events. For those who belong through place, the church building is the key. It may represent the past generations who've worshipped in that community, but crucially, it may also be a reminder of those who have shared faith with the present generation, and it's somewhere they can really connect with God. Belonging through relationships is, as you would expect, about belonging through other people. We all have key people in our church communities, don't we, that everybody knows. And so people start to feel a connection, a sense of belonging through them, through the conversations that they may have with them. And those relationships can help people to feel closer to God and again start to explore faith. Many of those who belong through activities are the regular churchgoers, some of whom will be office holders in the church, but also likely to be active and key members of other organisations, such as the toddler group, the WI, the food bank, the men's shed, all sorts of activities. But then we come to a group of people who belong through events. They don't want the commitment of going to church every week, but they feel very comfortable with the one-offs, with the celebrations. They're the people who will come to Harvest and Christmas and Mothering Sunday and possibly Easter. And they may also come to weddings and baptisms as well. So if you have a series of these special festival events planned in advance, then people may get into a rhythm of coming to church, slightly more on their terms, but a rhythm of coming to church. And in David Walker's research, he points out that none of this is necessarily superficial. Belonging in these ways can be a real experience of faith for many, so we should never disparage that. For those who belong by events, festivals are important ways of expressing that belonging to church. For those further away from the church, Festivals can be those initial ways of connecting. We need to celebrate in very outward-facing ways, with food at its heart, activity and fun. There should be a celebration of God's abundance and should capture some of the extravagant grace of God. Let's do it and do it well. They should be different to normal worship, whatever that is. Maybe not at the usual Sunday time, maybe not in a church building. And to do them well, it will take time and effort. So it's better to do a few well rather than overstretch your resources. To do any of this, sorry about that. To do any of this, you need to know the community. Who lives there? What do they already do? What day and time would work? Are you in a community where people commute? Are you in a community where they're able to join in only at certain times? Perhaps you can work with another church in the area or get some help from ecumenical partners from other churches in your circuit or your benefice or your group. And remember to advertise in different ways, everything from posters to invites through the door to invitations on Facebook. And as I said, have the next event planned so at least people can save the date. I think unless there are any questions, that's probably, are there any questions? It's probably a good time to hand over to Caroline, who's going to tell us about something a bit more specific.
So for me, it's always learning from people's experience, and particularly I'm going to focus on a piece of research that was done by Hereford Diocese in 2004. The question that they were trying to solve was, why were harvest festivals reducing in congregation numbers, but rogation was growing? And I'm just going to show you a few of their findings in terms of what we're going to look at are principles and assets, so that we can build on that for the second session this evening. So the things that they found, if you imagine yourself, if you've ever been on a rogation event, invariably there's a walk, and in a rhythm of walking, people felt that they could move around, and actually it was better for building relationships and getting to know. It was less threatening. Inevitably, there was food at the end of the walk, and again that time of fellowship, but also it was much more conducive for families to be able to share in that. If I say less liturgy, I do mean that in a kind way. It felt less threatening, and by not being in the church building, there were those horrors that we've all felt when we've gone into a strange church, as to whether you might stand up, sit down. You might have taken Mrs. Goggins's pew or something like that. It was just much less threatening, and because of, in some ways, the brevity of the liturgy, as they walked around the area or by whatever they did, they felt it was much more amiable as an occasion. And the other thing for me is they didn't feel the need to cross the threshold of the church building, which for some, and I think more so, it feels like a chasm if you've not been used to church. And what we do, trying to make that first step into the building and going into a service, it was just much easier to explore where they were, their local area. And then we come to the principles, which is, you know, why are we doing this activity? And for me, in whatever we do, we're trying to build community. And we talk about communities of community, but in a rural community, whether of whatever size it might be, even if it's 5 houses to a few thousand, actually that connectedness and rootedness, particularly if there are many miles between the town or the next community. But also for me, why are we doing this celebration? Why are we doing this festival? It's to have fellowship with one another. Then it's about teaching about what the church thinks about creation. If we're looking at the rural services, the agricultural year services, but also sometimes it was actually talking about the community, particularly on a rogation walk, was seeing the different farms or the fields or the houses, having that opportunity of learning about the community. It's about engagement. So rather than a didactic approach of being talked at, actually everybody could share their experiences. But ultimately, particularly the rural community, is about partnerships. For me, that's really, really important. Again, in 2004, it was a busy year, 2004, there was the Rural White Paper, which was saying that the 5 sustainable things in a community are the village hall, the school, the church, the pub, and the post office were the signs of a vibrant community. And depending what your community is like, wherever you are, it's probably the old school, the old post office, the old College Arms, or whatever the pub's called. The village hall might be a bit ramshackle, and it's only the church that remains in, of whatever denomination we might be. And in those principles, we're thinking about more about just than holding an event, but actually what are we trying to achieve in being together? Why are we being open? What are we wanting to do? And it's really easy because often our small communities, our small rural congregations, it's easy to feel that we're shattered, we're fatigued, we've tried everything, we don't know who else to ask, we're just a few people. How can we ever do anything? And particularly when you're running events, if you're in a small rural church, you probably haven't got the essentials, which, you know, one of them is being a kitchen or a toilet facilities. But in one of our parishes, we don't have kitchen or toilet facilities in the church because absolutely every square inch of it is grade 1 star and has historical significance. There's no way we could do that. However, Girl Guiding have a residential centre just up the road with parking, toilet facilities and a kitchen. So we always use that and share in the activities. The other thing sometimes, particularly possibly more so in Anglican churches, people say, well, we haven't got any electricity. How could we do that? And one of the churches that we'll see in the second session has no electricity. It has no running water. But one of the things that they do have is a group of people who are a part of a medieval music group, and they provide the music. The partnerships, so that's also about our other sister churches. Who are they in that community? But sometimes it might be the school. In our rogation walk, we have a farmer who runs educational tours, so he provides some of the wherewithal for that. The other thing about festivals is not just about the agricultural year, it's about the history. The history of the community often can provide a date that's significant that you might want to use as an event. Again, in one of our communities, King Edwin was converted in 627 AD, and we're looking to 2027 as being that event year for us, and using that. We've got not much else in the community. That is, as it were, in commercial sense, our unique selling point. And we've got a whole story around that, but also the opportunity to, as teaching, is about St. Paulinus, who was a missionary, talking about mission and how do we put that into a 21st century context. But also walking routes. I'm sure most of us have done some more walking than we ever did before in lockdown, and we've found more routes, and particularly in Yorkshire, and they now call it Welcome to Walkshire, and you see people all over the place. In our communities, we have about 5 different walking routes, which is the Wilberforce Way, we have the Yorkshire Wolds Way, we have the Minster Way, and every other way that you could possibly think of. And these are significant walking routes, but also the growth of the pilgrimage movement has just exploded over the last 5-6 years. And how might we create our own mini pilgrimage? So you might not be having a Rogation walk, but one could have a mini pilgrimage amongst churches, whether that's in one fixed community or in a group of communities. But also it depends on the dynamic, the demographic dynamic within our communities, because particularly when I was in Kent, one of our communities, we had 3% of the community were Indigenous people. Everybody else was an incomer. And therefore, in whatever we were doing was actually being a moment of history about the community, but actually talking about the life of the community. How might we live as a community? I'm a great fan of the Archers, and we all know that it's the story of everyday country life people. And actually for people moving in from a non-rural area, or even in a small rural area, is actually learning how to live community. How do things work about? If you've lived in a rural community all your life, you tend to know about it, but it's again that opportunity to share values, but also education in terms of enabling those partnerships and relationships as well. And I think it's also how, considering where we are, what type of farming, particularly, we were discussing a few weeks ago, and somebody was saying Plough Sunday doesn't mean anything because nobody's got a plough, because it's hillside farming. So, you know, what is appropriate, but also how might we adapt it and be creative in what we are doing. But also sometimes those festivals that, if we're not in a rural country, it might be semi-urban, there might be other things that are going on. So for me, there's always something that is unique to that community, to that church, but also by building those relationships, we widen that pool of resources for us. And that is a really big lesson of enabling people to feel that they can do something, particularly in rural areas, because everybody thinks that we should shut shop. We're not economic, we're not a viable commercial unit. And yet, particularly as the church, we are probably the only community organisation in that community. But also, when I was in my last job, people used to say I'm in community development. And I'm going, but we as a church have been in community development for the last 2,000 years. We're experts at it, and we've got provenance. So there's a real encouragement for us to do that. So thank you. And hopefully there's something that has inspired you and got you thinking, got the thought processes going.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Caroline and Elizabeth. We'll be coming back to you again in a little while. But we're going to go into some breakout rooms now for about 10 minutes. There will be a facilitator in your room. We've just got one question to reflect in our groups. So we'll introduce ourselves, see where we're all from, and then focus on the question. And the question is, share any experience you have of being part of a festival celebration, what worked and what didn't. So share any experience you have of being part of a festival celebration, what worked and what didn't. And then we'll come back in about 10 minutes and have some feedback from that. Thank you.
just take a little bit of feedback from our facilitators from your meetings and just help us think a little bit about some of the principles and whether they tie in with what Caroline shared with us. So if I could come to Andrew first, any feedback from your group, Andrew?
Yeah, just a couple of things to share. We talked about joining in with festivals, with things that are already going on in communities. And interesting, some of the examples we had just from our little group was the Up Heliar in Shetland and the fire festivals, Dickensian Weekend in Grassington, and the Derbyshire Well Dressing. All the things that are very local, but are good ways of joining in with festivals. So they were all mentioned. We had an example of more traditional festivals like Harvest and Christmas being marked in auction marts. That's a big event to join in with. And then we got into a bit of a conversation about funerals and whether funerals can also be festivals, but we didn't quite reach a conclusion about that. So that was our group.
Wonderful, thank you, Andrew. Carla, can I come to you?
Yeah, so we had a really good conversation about festivals, obviously, and talked about using kind of local history. So Thirsk used St James's Day to link into the St James's Green Day, and had lots of people there. Their only criticism of themselves would be that they didn't advertise it enough. So don't be fearful of advertising. We talked about the services where communities gather together, but maybe that's the only time folk do gather to worship. So lambing services important in certain areas. Talked about the project, community allotment project, where there's people with mental health, ill health and learning disability amongst a whole variety of people, and how they link that to Harvest Festival, and they encourage people to come along by eating the produce grown on the allotment, so they share in the produce together, and food seemed to be a big part of it, about bring and share, and the community lunch that happened in Baslow with 200 folk turning up to it, kind of for 8 years on the trot. So lots of things, and yeah, I think food seemed to feature at least in 2 of those.
Great, thank you. David, can I come to you?
Hi there. Yes, we've talked about, firstly, we talked a bit about how reopening buildings was quite a place to celebrate, and a church that had more than 20% of their community turn up, which was quite unusual, as much out of curiosity as anything else, to see the new building. And so don't be frightened to sort of celebrate newness and refurbishment as a time of celebration. We talked about churches providing knitting angels and yarn bombing the villages, and developing good stories there and connecting with people about how a church is, a village is on a crossroads, and how at Easter handing out hot cross buns and handing out chocolate eggs appropriately to people who came past. We talked about anniversary celebrations, loads of events, and connecting with the local schools and inviting people in, and particularly the young people, to come and play in the building, in effect, to say, open it up, this is your church in your community, in your place, and allowing them to explore openly and freely, and then encourage them to reflect a bit on the life and the feeling of the church. We talked about flower festivals, we talked about hymn singing festivals, we talked about particular mention of Father's Day, gathering, invite your father along to worship, and then the preacher having a slab of lagers behind the pulpit to hand out to the fathers who had arrived. Talked about Christmas tree festivals, gathering people in and connecting with local businesses, and even in lockdown, connections where people have been able to share things like posadas around the village, but not in people's homes, but having them out in the community for people to photograph and then share them on Facebook. And as well as that, talking about village Christmas pageants, and a number of villages where a pageant had walked the streets, connecting with the local businesses and drawing people out onto the streets, into the community in that way.
Wonderful. Well, you managed to fit an awful lot into 10 minutes, David, and that was impressive. Our group, we talked about Advent and actually what COVID has given us, in the sense of forcing us out into the community, and the sense of walking through the villages and making activities for the children to join in with. So anything with a bit of a competition in it seems to have worked well. And we also recognise Caroline's principles around the walking and the talking and the low access point level for people not having to go into a church building, and those opportunities through things like Mother's Day for giving, you know, going around the communities again, giving away cards and primroses and those sorts of things. So real engagement with people that would never necessarily walk through our church doors. So yeah, very good conversation. I'm going to stop there because we want to just give you a 5-minute wriggle break, if that's okay.
Thank you. In this next session, we're going to talk about some of the things you've obviously started talking about in your groups. We're going to talk about a cycle of engagement, and then Caroline's going to talk about joining in with things that are already going on. So if I could have the slide, please, Catherine, about the cycle of engagement. This is just a useful way of beginning to map the year of your community. Obviously, we've got the months on the wheel. Outside there's a sort of rhythm of the school. If you've got a school, primary school in your community, then that of itself gives you times when you might be able to interact with them. If you look on the inside of the circle, we've got Advent, Epiphany, Lent, Pentecost. The church year is going round. So you've got the school year, the calendar year, and the church year. Yes, we can send you the slides, I'm sure. And then these red circles are some things that we've picked out that people can engage with. So schools reopening. Is there something that churches can or should do? That very much depends. Children are returning to school. Some might be going for the first time. Is that something the church can be involved with? And then September, October, you have harvest. How can you celebrate harvest differently? We've already talked about some ways, but I remember challenging a congregation to prepare their harvest meal with as much local and fairly traded produce as possible. And it became a real competition to see how closely they could get the ingredients. And puddings tended to come from back gardens in the form of apples and plums and all the things that they had grown. So that's a real good way of getting the community involved, as somebody talked about allotments and using that produce. And we know that people like food, so working together on something like that can be a good way of connecting. And then through Advent, I think it was David's group mentioned that it was David's group that mentioned about Fasada going around the community in a different way. One of my last churches, we always went around the community rather than people's homes. We took it to the different community areas. So it was a village that was blessed with a shop. So they went to the shop, they went to the doctor's surgery, they went to the school. Always start at the school, because that's a good way. You tell them the story, and then as the figures go around the community, they can see, and they probably start to tell their parents about it. I mean, for me, one of the great prizes was when a child went to the doctors and the Posada figures were at the doctors, and she said, "Oh, Mummy, Mary and Joseph have come to the doctors too. That makes me feel better." So once you've done Advent, then of course there's all the things about Christmas, and carol singing outside seems to be a no-brainer. It's a good way of involving people with what's going on. And then we move into January and Plough Sunday. Yes, lots of farmers don't plough now. They use different ways. They might be doing minimum tillage, or if they're in high ground, they won't use a plough. But its roots go back to the return to work after the 12 days of Christmas. So all sorts of people will be returning to work. Yes, if you've got a plough in the community and can link it into the farming year, do. But otherwise, who else is going back to work? is there a way you can celebrate or at least share together what that feels like? Thank you. Sorry, did somebody ask a question? No, right. And then we've got Candlemas. You start to have Lent courses, Easter, all sorts of things we know about. Easter processions, crosses in the middle of the community that are decorated with flowers on Easter Day. But then we come to rogation, which Caroline has talked about a lot, and which we've just come through. And the only thing that I would add to that is that one year when we were doing a walk around a particular farm, there were several elderly members of the congregation that just couldn't make the walk. So we went the week before and filmed it. And then my husband sat in church with those that couldn't walk it, watching the film and saying prayers together. And then they got tea for those who had been out walking. And for one retired farmer's wife said, oh, it was so good to see her farm again. So that's another way of making things accessible to people who perhaps can't access them readily by themselves. And then one that sort of gets forgotten, and I never knew about Lammas, not until I was in a rural area. But Lammas, that the harvest of the first fruits, the time when they used to take the first of the cereal harvest and grind it and make a loaf of bread to celebrate Mass, Lammas. And it's about taking the first fruits. Well, let's have a day baking bread together. Look at bread church, find ways of using bread, but also the first fruits. What are other people's first fruits? Those ideas that we have, we think, what other people might be celebrating things that for the first time. So there are ways of starting to bring all those things together. And even if you only do 3 or 4 of those, you've got specific times when you're consciously connecting with your community, perhaps in more overt ways, which may mean that when where the community individuals may be more relaxed about interacting with you at other times, and they see that you're really quite ordinary and that they can have a conversation with you. Now, Caroline is going to talk about, going to talk about how you join in things that are already going on. Thank you, Caroline.
So we've talked about rogation and just going from the first principles of being able to walk around farms and joining together. And the one on the photograph on your left-hand side was facilitated by the local walking group, so that they had stewards and guides and knew how to keep everybody safe. And as I mentioned in the first session, and building on Elizabeth's comment about people not being very mobile, well, we made people mobile by the local farmer getting his trailer out and showing us his cattle. And it's always interesting when you get farmers together, because they always compare notes and check out. But I think the adults had much more fun than the children going out on the trailer. But it was a real sharing, because although when we stopped and the farmers would talk about their land and stuff like that, in between spots, we had the local historian who told us about the buildings as we went past them as on the drive-by. And it's also in this community that we have 2 polo clubs. So we were able to look at the fields as well, but there was no polo matches that day. But it's just taking the church out into the community, having that opportunity. But it's also about how might we be church in the community as well. And there's always the village fete or the agricultural show. And what churches are really good at are a good cup of tea. And for me, you know, the principle of gossiping the gospel is that people are open, people have got time, and people are interested. And this is an opportunity of riding on the back of somebody else's event, which is a lot less hassle of organising, and just being present and people seeing the church beyond the building and having that conversation with people. The next is beyond the agricultural services. So the top left was one of my former churches where we had a really good set of musicians, and we didn't have any facilities, but we were blessed with a really beautiful summer's day. And so it was just an entertainment of summer music, but using the church was not big enough to have hospitality, but using the churchyard as both a hospitality venue, but also using it as in terms of history. And so people wandered around and had a look. And this includes another church where they would have their annual churchyard tour of sharing that history and being, but also having a community arts project, which is the top right. They had somebody who was a potter, they could bring everybody together, got the children and adults to be able to share and create this community art piece. And as I mentioned, the bottom right is this church which 10, 15 years ago was looking to be closed. And one woman from the community who at that time didn't believe in Christianity, was a bit of a pagan, she would say, at that time. But under the threat of closure, she began to get to know the church, and over the 10 years has been really instrumental by willing to be a church warden and then going on from that. So they've set up what they call the Community of St Margaret, which is a group of lay people meeting and sharing together. As I said, she's a member of a medieval music group, so that's how they provide their music for evensong. But also she's passionate about the environment. And for me, this is one thing. We talk about festivals, but also in terms of social justice, social action, it could say something about the church's sort of interests as well, by thinking about Fair Trade Fortnight or Water Day, National Water Day, or something like that. There's so many different days. And actually thinking, what are the passions within our own congregations? We don't think about the festivals, but might we be able to communicate something that we're really interested in our own community? So it could be British Food Fortnight if you want to stay food or rurally orientated, or it might be modern slavery. There's lots of stuff through the Clear Initiative, which is a church organisation on modern slavery. It might be homelessness or digital poverty or whatever it might be that is a passion within the congregation. It's an opportunity of being able to share that with the wider community, and again is an opportunity for advocacy about what the church thinks on such issues, particularly social justice issues. Climate change is an obvious one, but there are other things that we could share with one another. The other thing that is a real motivator, I think, is actually about prayer of and for the people. And this is a really old notice from 1860, where the then Archbishop of Canterbury told everybody to pray. I think they're in the midst of drought and needed rain, or vice versa, and actually calling people to offer prayers. One of the opportunities that we might be able to do that, like All Souls, has become much more of a bigger activity than it has been in the past. But also the plough has been there for a long, long time. And actually some things that we can remind ourselves that we have been at the heart of that community, the joys, the sorrows, the celebrations, the festivities. And particularly as we're coming out of lockdown, what opportunities do we have of bringing community together? What are things that our motivations, our passions, our creativities that we could offer? And it might be beyond those agricultural things, it might be beyond those rural things. It might be, as I had in one of my former congregations, we supported a school in India because of that person's family relationships, and actually giving that global aspect beyond the parochial boundary or the community boundary. There's always something in the community that is a real passion, maybe as somebody else, that we can build on and share. So there are many things, and it's just finding what really resonates with your church community and your wider community that brings everybody together to that point of celebration and fellowship, but also how might we use that opportunity to gossip the gospel, say what the church is about, what does Jesus say about this, but also how we might pray and encourage one another. And going back to the lady who began from a pagan to becoming church warden, she was ordained last year and is ministering in rural communities. So you never know what's going to happen by that engagement. And I think particularly in rural communities, it's so easy to look around a church hall and see 5 or 6 people and think this is all we've got. And just that process of invitation might change and transform somebody's life, and she's now transforming other communities as well. So we just never know what we can do. So all things are possible with God, I believe. So that's where we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Elizabeth, again. That was a great example to end on. We appreciate that. So we're going to go back into our breakout rooms again for about 10 minutes. And just one question again. So the question we're looking at this time is, what sort of community events could your church join in with? What sort of community events could your church join in with? So we'll go back into, I'm going back into Advent. I don't know where everybody else is going.
Welcome back, everyone. Just time for a little bit of feedback from each group. We had such an interesting conversation, so I hope we can hear from each group and some of your wonderful ideas. Carla, can we come to you first?
Yeah, so we talked about a Facebook-based Advent window trail that happened last year, is going to be built on this year, hopefully. Orchard groups and apple days, joining in with community events that are kind of happening already. At Scarecrow festivals and domino drives put on for the community. We had a bit of a discussion whether it was a gala or a gala, but either way, a float attended. And a good time was had with the gazebo in the gala or gala field. We never got to scone and scones, you'll be pleased to know.
You just didn't have time for that, Carla.
No. And barbecue and that kind of, people being surprised by the church giving a free gift, but kind of earning that trust as they go forward and think that the church is all right.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. David, can we come to you next?
We talked about connecting with sporting events, with things like the Tours de Yorkshire coming through, and the fell races and cricket matches happening in the village, just being a presence. We talked about local music festivals that people had stalls at, and how they encouraged people to contribute to prayers, and then took those prayers into church and prayed around people's issues. And we talked about village fates, and I would say galas coming from South Durham, stalls with children activities. We talked about coffee mornings, being able to open up the church and offer facilities and hospitality where other places aren't available. We talked about village fates and sharing. We talked about a community celebration week, connecting with outdoor services and worship, putting that into the place. We talked about providing kindness in context. So, for example, things like, you know, motorcycle gatherings where Christian groups go in and provide a helmet store, for example, for people who are on the site. And so it's just looking at what's specifically needed and providing what's in context. We talked about just putting a jigsaw out in church and having the room open and people coming in. We talked about a lot of our church, school, a lot of our villages where the pubs are no longer functioning and have closed. And we're going into a conversation about providing what we can provide directly for our communities where we can see what's missing.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you so much, David. Andrew?
Okay, yeah, some of the same, so I won't repeat some of that because all the stuff about fates and scarecrows and all those sort of things. And we talked about the value of becoming accepted in a village, and often that was through getting involved in some of these events and showing, you know, you're interested in that and getting involved. And about the relationships things like Caroline had shared, and we talked about a similar thing in Malham with somebody that got involved in the sensory garden there. Interestingly, we also, somebody shared about different landmarks, dates, things like GCSE exams, tax returns, that actually we might base our festivals around different events that aren't necessarily the agricultural ones. And we talked about a homework hub that was a rural isolation project.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. And very quickly, just to add to that, we're very excited in our group about Lammas and the whole idea of baking bread together and, you know, being able to share communion or a love feast in some way as a first steps for people. We talked about Open Farm Sunday, where church had actually taken place on the farm and in a barn, which is exciting, and Pentecost being spring harvest, which I didn't realise, where, you know, people coming together with their seedlings and planting and growing and sharing the food afterwards, basically aligning what we're doing with the community, which is, we thought Caroline was really important, which requires deep listening. So we thought our task was some deep listening to community, to hear the story and hear where we could engage. Thank you. I'm handing back to Carla, I think.
So let me offer you some thanks. It's been a really great evening. Thank you, Elizabeth and Caroline, for reminding us of the importance of festivals. Thanks for helping us to think creatively of how we can engage with our communities and to think a little bit outside the box. You've provided some really thought-provoking ideas for us, and I'm sure that lots of us will be going away with ideas spinning in our minds of what we might get up to as we go ahead in this year. So thank you ever so much. Thank you to the group facilitators who have helped lead the breakout rooms, to I would say tech team, but it's tech individual, to Catherine, who's kept the show on the road. Thank you. But most of all, thank you to you as participants. We would have had a really miserable time really on our own. So thank you for coming along, and we hope that you'll come to future events. We invite you to put the next Positively Rural event in your diary. It's on the 7th of July, thanks Catherine, at 1 o'clock, Countryside Challengers, and we're going to have representatives from the NFU and the Arthur Rank Centre. So do put that date in your diary, and we look forward to seeing you there. So I'm going to hand over to Caroline and to Elizabeth now as we close our devotions.
So on Saturday, it was the feast of Saint Isidore, who is the patron saint of rural communities and all things rural. So in a way of offering thanks to God, but also just processing our discussions and all that we've heard this evening. But we're also thinking, I'm sure, about the communities that we're serving and ministering to. So the great Psalm 65 is often said at any rural worship, and I thought I'd read it as a reflection, but also it just has so many themes within it pertinent to our evening. So praise awaits you, our God in Zion. To you our vows will be fulfilled. You who answer prayer, to you all people will come. When we were overwhelmed by sins, you forgave our transgressions. Blessed are those you choose and bring near to live in your courts. We are filled with the good things of your house, of your holy temple. You answer us with awesome and righteous deeds, God our Saviour, the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas, who formed the mountains by your power, having armed yourself with strength, who stilled the roaring of the seas and the roaring of their waves and the turmoil of the nations. The whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders. When morning dawns, where evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. You care for the land and water it, you enrich it abundantly. The streams of God are filled with water to provide the people with grain, for so you have ordained it. You drench its furrows and level its ridges. You soften it with showers and bless its crops. You crown the year with your bounty, and your carts overflow with abundance. The grasslands of the wilderness overflow. The hills are clothed with gladness. The meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. They shout for joy and sing. So as we leave this time together, we pray for peace in our homes, for comfort for those keeping vigil, for those who are in darkness that they may find light. Creator God, whose will it is that the earth and the sea should bear fruit in due season, bless the labours of those who work on land and sea. Grant us a good harvest and the grace always to rejoice in your fatherly care. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
So thank you once again to Caroline and to Elizabeth, and for you for joining us. Good night and God bless.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank